In 1903, girls in Hartwell, Texas started disappearing through their bedroom windows. Locked rooms, sealed glass, no way out. But here's the thing, they weren't kidnapped. They were replaced. Something from the other side of every mirror had learned to cross over, and it wanted their lives. The girls came back. Same faces, same voices. But if you looked closely at their reflections, you'd see something that made parents scream. This is the true story of the Window Girls of Texas, and it's more terrifying than you can imagine. The town of Hartwell sat like a blister on the dry skin of West Texas. A collection of weathered buildings and desperate hopes clustered around the intersection of two dirt roads that led nowhere important. In the spring of 1903, it was home to 347 souls, though that number would soon begin its terrible decline. Margaret Ashford was 14 years old when she became the first of the Window Girls, though no one called them that yet. On the evening of March 12th, she sat in her second-floor bedroom, doing what she did every evening after supper, gazing out her window at the vast emptiness beyond Hartwell's meager borders, dreaming of places she'd never see. Her mother, Ellen Ashford, would later tell Sheriff Coleman Briggs that Margaret had always been a dreamer, always staring out windows like she could see something the rest of them couldn't. She'd press her face right up against that glass, Ellen said, wringing her handkerchief until it threatened to tear. Said she liked how cold it felt. Said it made her feel like she could step through it and be somewhere else. That evening was unseasonably warm for March, the kind of false spring that tricks the wildflowers into blooming too soon. Ellen had called Margaret down for supper 3 times before finally climbing the stairs herself. Her patience worn thin by a day of washing and mending. She found the bedroom door ajar, the curtains billowing in a breeze that shouldn't have existed. All the windows were closed. Margaret was gone. The window, however, was extraordinary. Ellen would never find adequate words to describe it, though she tried countless times in the days and weeks that followed. The glass seemed to ripple like water, its surface reflecting not the room behind her, but something else entirely. A vast darkness, punctuated by distant lights, that moved in patterns no stars should follow. When she reached out to touch it, her fingers passed through the glass, as though it were merely an image painted on air. She screamed then, a sound that brought her husband Thomas running from the barn, his boots pounding up the stairs like thunder. By the time he reached the room, the window had returned to normal, just ordinary glass reflecting an ordinary room. But Margaret was still gone, and no amount of searching would find her. Sheriff Briggs opened fire, his revolver thundering in the confined space. The bullets passed through the shadow things as though they were made of smoke, doing nothing to slow their advance. Thomas Ashford threw himself over his family, shielding them with his body as the things swept past, searching for new hosts, new bodies to steal. Ruth Morrison stood frozen, staring at the flood of horrors pouring from the between, and for a terrible moment, Dr. Yates thought she would be taken again. But Agnes grabbed the girl and pulled her behind a barrier of salt she'd hastily poured across the floor, creating a refuge that the shadow things couldn't cross. The mirrors. Dr. Yates shouted over the chaos. "We have to break all the mirrors! Seal the gaps!" But as Briggs moved to obey, one of the shadow things coalesced into something more solid, more defined. It took the shape of a man, tall, elegant, dressed in clothes from no era Dr. Yates could identify. Its face was beautiful and terrible, perfectly symmetrical but somehow wrong, like a painting of a person rather than a person themselves. "Enough," it said, and its voice carried such weight that everyone in the schoolhouse froze. Even the other shadow things stopped their advance, hovering in the air like smoke suspended in amber. The keeper had arrived. It glided, really, its feet not quite touching the floor toward the open gap in reality. "You've been meddling in forces you don't understand," it said, looking at each of them in turn with eyes that reflected nothing, absorbed everything, stealing back what we've fairly claimed. "Breaking the ancient compact." "There is no compact," Agnes said, her voice steady despite the terror written on her face. "You're parasites, thieves. You have no right to these children." The keeper smiled, and it was like watching a crack spread across porcelain. No, right? We've been taking reflections since before your kind learned to make fire. Every culture knows us, fears us, makes rules about mirrors and windows to try to keep us out. But the rules only work if people remember them. And your kind, it gestured dismissively. You've forgotten so much. You build houses made of glass, fill them with mirrors, stare into reflections for hours every day, never thinking about what might be staring back. It moved closer to Dr. Yates, studying him like a specimen under glass. You've learned our weakness, the forced exchange. But you haven't learned the cost. Every time you break a mirror to send one of us back, you weaken the barrier a little more. Keep doing it, and eventually, it gestured at the open gap. This happens. The between starts bleeding into your world. And once that process begins, it cannot be stopped. Dr. Yates felt his stomach drop. You're lying. Am I? The keeper walked to the open gap and placed one hand against its edge. Where it touched, the tear grew larger, spreading like a crack in ice. Every mirror you break, every window you shatter, every forced exchange, they're all wounds in the fabric that separates our realm from yours. Small wounds, perhaps, but wounds nonetheless. And wounds, if left untreated, tend to spread. Then what do you want? Sheriff Briggs demanded, his empty revolver still gripped in white-knuckled hands. The keeper turned those terrible eyes on him. I want you to stop. Accept that the girls you've lost are gone. The copies we've left are adequate replacements, better even. They don't age, don't sicken, don't die. They'll be perfect daughters forever. Isn't that what every parent wants? They're not our daughters, Ellen Ashford said, her voice raw. They're wearing their faces like masks. And what is a person? The keeper asked. But the sum of their faces, their masks, their performances. Your daughter, it gestured at the real Margaret, trembling in her father's arms, has been changed by her time in the between. The girl you knew is gone, replaced by this traumatized, broken thing. In what way is she more real than the copy we left you? The question hung in the air, poisonous in its logic. Because there was truth in it, Dr. Yates realized with horror. Margaret had been changed by her ordeal. She would never be the same girl who disappeared through her window. In a sense, that girl was gone forever, whether they rescued her body or not. Because she chose to survive, Ruth Morrison said suddenly, stepping out from behind Agnes's salt barrier. Because she fought and ran and hoped, even when hope seemed impossible. Because she's human, with all the messy, painful, beautiful complexity that means. Your copies, they're perfect, and that's exactly what's wrong with them. We're not supposed to be perfect. We're supposed to be real. The keeper looked at Ruth for a long moment, and something like respect flickered across its inhuman features. Brave, it said. Foolish, but brave. Very well. I'll offer you a choice. A compact, if you will. Stop trying to rescue the others. Stop weakening the barriers. And I'll seal this gap myself. You can keep the two you've already saved. The rest will remain with us, and we'll continue our work slowly, carefully, taking only those who truly wish to leave, who press their faces against the glass and dream of elsewhere. And if we refuse? Dr. Yates asked. The keeper's smile widened. Then we stop being careful. The barriers are already weakened by your interference. One more forced exchange, maybe two, and they'll collapse entirely. The between will flood into your world like water through a shattered dam. Every mirror, every window, every reflective surface will become a doorway, and we are so very numerous and so very hungry. It's a trap, Agnes said. Whatever we choose, we lose. Accept the deal and the other girls remain prisoners forever. Refuse, and we destroy the world trying to save them. The keeper inclined its head. All choices are traps, old woman. The only question is which trap you prefer to be caught in. They stood in the schoolhouse as night fell completely, the broken mirror still gaping open, shadow things hovering at its edges like sharks circling prey. The keeper waited patiently, inhuman and eternal. while the humans struggled with their impossible decision. Doctor? Yates looked at Margaret Ashford, who clung to her parents with desperate intensity, and at Ruth Morrison, who stood straighter now, stronger, as though speaking her truth had returned something stolen from her. 2 girls saved. 2 chances at real life returned to them. But how many others remained trapped in the between? Sarah Chen was still there, still running through those endless corridors of glass. And how many more? Dozens? Hundreds? Ruth had spoken of girls from other times, other places. How far back did this theft go? How many lives had been stolen to feed the between's hunger? I need to think, Doctor, Yates said. Give us until dawn. We'll have an answer then. The keeper shrugged, a gesture it had learned from watching. Humans, but performed with too perfect precision. Dawn, then. But know this, every moment that gap remains open, more of us can cross. Even now, my siblings are spreading through your little town, finding windows, watching, waiting. By dawn, there may not be enough of Hartwell left to save. It gestured, and the shadow things retreated through the gap, flowing back into the between like smoke drawn by a wind. The keeper was the last to go, pausing at the threshold to look back at them. We've been called many things over the ages, it said. Demons, spirits, reflections that live, but we're none of those things. We're simply what happens when nothing wants to become something, when the space between mirrors grows aware of what it's missing. We don't hate you. We just want what you have, substance, form, reality. Is that so wrong? Then it was gone, and the gap remained open, but empty, showing only the vast maze of the between stretching away into impossible distances. They left the schoolhouse in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Sheriff Briggs posted deputies around the building with orders to shoot anyone, anything that tried to enter. Though they all knew bullets would be useless against what might come, Dr. Yates returned to his boarding house room to find every window covered in faces. They pressed against the glass from outside, impossible given the height, dozens of pale faces with 2 dark eyes and smiles that revealed too many teeth. They didn't try to break through. They just watched, patient and hungry, waiting for the barriers to fail. He tried to write, to document everything that had happened, but his hands shook too badly to hold the pen. Instead, he sat in his lamp-lit room and thought about the choice before them. If they accepted the keeper's deal, they condemned unknown numbers of girls to eternal imprisonment in the between. Those girls would run forever through corridors of mirrors, hunted by shadow things, copied and studied and used as templates for better imposters. It was a fate he couldn't imagine inflicting on anyone, let alone children who'd done nothing but look out a window and wish for something more. But if they refused, if they continued the forced exchanges, they would eventually shatter the barrier completely. The between would hemorrhage into reality, and those same girls would be freed along with everything else that lived in that terrible place. The keeper had implied there were millions of the shadow things, maybe more, all desperate to cross over, all hungry for form and substance. Hartwell would be consumed in hours, Texas in days. And then what? How far would the contagion spread before it burned itself out? Unless it didn't burn out. Unless the shadow things simply kept spreading, kept copying, kept replacing, until there was nothing left but reflections pretending to be real. A third option existed, he realized as the night deepened toward morning. They could do nothing. Let the gap seal itself naturally over time, let the keeper's ultimatum expire, return to their lives as though none of this had happened. Margaret and Ruth were safe. That was something. Perhaps it was enough. But even as he considered it, he knew he couldn't choose that path, because doing nothing was itself a choice, and it was a choice to abandon Sarah Chen and all the others to their fate. How could he live with himself, knowing they were still there, still suffering, still hoping for rescue? At midnight, he heard footsteps outside his door and opened it to find Agnes Whitmore standing there with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. They sat together in his room, drinking in silence for a while, watching the faces watch them from the windows. "I've been thinking about what the keeper said," Agnes finally spoke, "about the barriers weakening every time we force an exchange. What if there's another way? What if instead of forcing them back, we invited them back? Dr. Yates looked at her sharply. What do you mean? The ritual works on exchange a copy for an original. But what if we could convince the copies to go back voluntarily, to trade places willingly? Then it wouldn't be a forced break in reality, wouldn't weaken the barriers. It would be a negotiated crossing, done with the between's consent, rather than against it. Why would they ever agree to that? They've stolen bodies, claimed lives. Why would they give that up? Agnes swirled the whiskey in her glass, watching the amber liquid catch the lamplight. Because they're not monsters. Not really. They're victims too, in their way. Trapped in the between just as much as the girls they've taken. The keeper said it himself, they want to be real, to have substance and form. But wearing stolen bodies isn't the same as being real. Deep down, they must know that. They're still just echoes, still just shadows, pretending. Dr. Yates considered this. So we appeal to something like their conscience, assuming they have one, or to their self-interest. What if we offered them a real way to become substantial, not through theft, but through transformation? There must be other ways for nothing to become something. Perhaps we could help them find it. That's Dr. Yates stopped, his mind racing. That's actually brilliant. If we could broker a true peace, a real compact, then the girls go free, and the shadow things get what they want without destroying reality in the process. There's just one problem, Agnes said. We'd need to negotiate with the keeper itself. And that means going into the between, going to where it's strongest, where it makes the rules. They looked at each other across the small table, both understanding what that meant. Someone would have to cross through the gap, enter that maze of mirrors and madness, and somehow convince an ancient, inhuman entity to accept terms that went against everything it had done for millennia. It was suicide. It was also the only chance they had. Dawn came cold and gray, mist rising from the ground like the earth itself was exhaling ghosts. Dr. Yates stood before the schoolhouse with Sheriff Briggs, Agnes Whitmore, and Ruth Morrison, watching the gap in reality shimmer and pulse like a wound in the world. The town was gathered behind them, not all 347 souls, but enough. Word had spread about what was happening, and while some families had fled during the night, others had stayed, determined to fight for their home and their children. Helen and Thomas Ashford were there, Margaret between them, holding both their hands. The Chen family had come, Daniel Chen's face etched with desperate hope for his lost daughter. You don't have to do this, Sheriff Briggs said to Dr. Yates for the dozenth time. We could just seal the gap, live with the consequences. But Dr. Yates shook his head. He'd made his decision in the dark, hours before dawn. Had Dr. Yates written letters to his colleagues and family, had prepared himself as much as anyone could prepare for walking into impossible spaces to negotiate with inhuman forces. Someone has to try, he said simply, and I'm the one who understands what they are, what they want. I'm the best chance we have. Then I'm coming with you, Ruth said, stepping forward before anyone could stop her. Absolutely not, Doctor. Yates began, but Ruth cut him off. I've been there. I know how to navigate it, how to avoid the worst dangers. You'll be lost in minutes without a guide. Besides, her young face was set with determination beyond her years. They took my life from me. They took weeks, or months, or years. I still don't know how long I was really there. I deserve to look them in the eye and demand an explanation. Dr. Yates wanted to refuse, wanted to protect this girl who'd already suffered so much, but he knew she was right. He needed a guide, and Ruth was the only one who'd been in the con. Between and returned to tell about it. Agnes pressed something into his hand, a small leather pouch. Salt and silver, she said, and something else. A piece of mirror from my house, one of the oldest, clearest pieces I own. Keep it with you. It will help you see clearly when the between tries to confuse you. And if things go wrong, she didn't finish, but Dr. Yates understood. If things went wrong, he could break the mirror piece and try to force his way back. Sheriff Briggs handed him a revolver. I know bullets don't work on them, but it might make you feel better to have it anyway. Doctor? Yates smiled weakly. Thanks. He and Ruth approached the gap together, and as they drew near, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. Frost formed on the wooden floor around the opening, and their breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. Through the gap, they could see the between clearly now, that vast space of corridors and chambers, all made of mirrors reflecting mirrors into infinite recursion. And in the distance, standing at the center of what might have been a room, or might have been a cathedral, the keeper waited. Doctor. Yates looked back at the assembled townspeople one last time. He saw hope and fear and desperation in their faces, saw parents clutching children, saw Sheriff Briggs standing straight and solid like he could hold back chaos through pure force of will. If we're not back by nightfall, he said, seal the gap. Break every mirror in this room if you have to, but seal it. Don't let anything else through. Then he took Ruth's hand, and together they stepped through the gap into the between. The transition was jarring, like falling and flying and standing still, all at once. Reality twisted sideways, and suddenly they were standing in a corridor made entirely of mirrors. Every surface reflected them, showed them from angles that shouldn't exist, showed versions of themselves that were subtly wrong. In one reflection, Dr. Yates was old, his hair completely white. In another, Ruth was crying blood. In a third, neither of them was human at all. Don't look too long at any one reflection, Ruth warned, pulling him forward. If you stare too long, you start to forget which one is really you. That's how they trap people. They make you lose track of yourself. They walked through corridors that branched and twisted, following a path only Ruth could see. Sometimes they passed windows that looked out onto other places, a street in New York, a beach in California, a desert that might have been Mars, or might have been just another part of Texas. And sometimes they saw other girls running past in parallel corridors, girls who glanced at them with desperate, pleading eyes before vanishing around corners made of glass. Sarah! Ruth called out as they passed one window, and for a moment, Sarah Chen was there, looking back at them through the glass. But when Ruth reached for the window, Sarah shook her head, frantically, and pointed behind them, then disappeared. Doctor. Yates turned to see a shadow thing sliding along the mirror walls, watching them with eyes that formed and dissolved and reformed in different configurations. It didn't approach, didn't attack, just watched, waited. They were being herded, Dr. Yates realized, guided toward the center of the between, toward the place where the keeper waited. Everything here was controlled, deliberate. They'd been allowed to enter because the keeper wanted this confrontation. Finally, after what might have been minutes or hours, time felt wrong here. Elastic and uncertain, they emerged into a vast open space. It was circular, or perhaps spherical. Its walls made of thousands upon thousands of mirrors, arranged in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. And at the center, sitting on a throne made of broken glass and fractured reflections, was the keeper. It looked different here, more real somehow. Its features were sharper, its presence more solid, as though being in the between allowed it to be more fully itself than the physical world permitted. You came? It said, and its voice echoed from every mirror surrounding them in stereo. I didn't think you would. Most humans, faced with an impossible choice, choose denial. They choose to do nothing rather than risk doing the wrong thing. We're not here to fight, Dr. Yates said, his voice steadier than he felt. We're here to negotiate, to find a way that serves everyone's interests. The keeper laughed, and it was like crystal shattering. Negotiate? You're in my realm now, Professor. I make the rules here. I could trap you in this moment forever. Have you lived this conversation over and over for eternity? Or I could scatter your reflections across 10,000 mirrors, make you exist in all of them simultaneously until you forget what it means to be singular. Why would I negotiate when I could simply take what I want? Because we can give you something. You can't take, Ruth said, stepping forward. We can give you the truth about what you are and what you could become. The keeper's attention snapped to her, And Dr. Yates felt the weight of that gaze like a physical pressure. "Brave girl," it said. "You've been here before. You know what we can do to you. Yet you return. Why?" "Because you're not evil," Ruth said. "You're just wrong. You think stealing our forms will make you real. But it won't. You're still just shadows wearing masks. The bodies you take, they're not yours. They'll never be yours. You'll always just be copies, echoes, reflections of something you're not." The keeper's expression darkened. "And what would you have us do? We've existed in this non-space for longer than your kind has drawn breath. We've watched you through every reflective surface, studied you, envied you. You have substance, form, the ability to affect the world. We have nothing but hunger and observation. When we found we could cross over, could take what you had." Its voice grew passionate, almost desperate. "For the first time in our endless existence, we could be something more than watchers. And you want to take that from us?" "No," Dr. Yates said, pulling out his journal and flipping to a page he'd marked. "We want to give you something better. I've been researching, talking to Agnes, about old stories and myths. There are legends about shadows gaining substance, about reflections becoming real. But they all require the same thing, not theft, but transformation. A willing sacrifice, not a stolen life." He showed the keeper a sketch he'd made, a diagram based on Agnes's descriptions of ancient rituals. What if there was a way to give you form without taking ours? What if humans could volunteer, could offer part of their essence freely to help you solidify? Not a replacement, but a fusion human and shadow working together to create something new. The keeper leaned forward, studying the diagram with eyes that suddenly seemed very old and very tired. "You're describing symbiosis, partnership." "Yes," Dr. Yates said. "Instead of parasitism, cooperation. Humans who are willing, and there might be some people who are lonely or lost or looking for purpose, could bond with your kind. You'd gain substance, we'd gain whatever wisdom or power you possess. Both sides would benefit. And the girls we've already taken? You return them," Ruth said firmly. "All of them. Every girl in every corridor. You send them home, and in exchange, we help you find willing partners. People who understand what they're agreeing to, who choose this path instead of having it forced upon them." The keeper was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, Dr. Yates could hear the whispers of thousands of shadow things echoing through the between, all listening, all waiting to hear what their keeper would decide. "It's been so long," the keeper finally said, and its voice carried a weight of ages. "So long watching, waiting, wanting. When we first learned we could cross, could take, it felt like freedom. But you're right. It's not real. We wear your faces, but we don't understand them. We speak your words, but they taste like ash in mouths we've borrowed. We thought copying would make us real, but we're still just copies." It stood from its throne of broken glass and approached them, and Dr. Yates fought the urge to step back. Up close, he could see that the keeper was constantly shifting, its form never quite settling, like looking at something through water. Arrived within the hour, a lean man with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen enough tragedy to last 3 lifetimes. He examined the window, the room, the ground beneath the window, which was 12 feet down, and showed no signs of disturbance, no ladder marks, no footprints. The window was locked from the inside. The door had been in Ellen's sight the entire evening. "Maybe she ran off," Briggs suggested, though his tone carried no conviction. Girls that age, they get notions. But Thomas Ashford shook his head. "All her things are here. Her good dress, the money she'd been saving, even her mother's locket she never took off. What kind of running away is that?" The sheriff had no answer. He organized a search party that combed through the scrublands surrounding Hartwell for 3 days, finding nothing but rattlesnakes and disappointment. By the 4th day, most folks had returned to their lives, filing Margaret Ashford away in that mental space reserved for tragedies that can't be explained or resolved. Only Ellen kept vigil. sitting in Margaret's room night after night, staring at that window as though she could will her daughter back through it. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of night, she thought she could see shapes moving in the glass shadows that shouldn't exist, that seemed to notice her watching. But whenever she blinked or looked away, there was only her own reflection staring back, hollow-eyed and afraid. 3 weeks after Margaret vanished, Sarah Chen went missing. The Chen family ran Hartwell's General Store, having arrived from San Francisco 7 years prior with dreams of prosperity that Texas had only partially fulfilled. Sarah was 16, practical and sharp-witted, the kind of girl who kept the store's books and could calculate change faster than most men could count. She was not, by any measure, a dreamer or a romantic. She was not the type to stare out windows. But on the evening of April 2nd, her younger brother Timothy found her room empty, the window standing open despite the night's chill. Like Margaret's window, it reflected something impossible, not the darkening street outside, but a corridor of mirrors extending into infinite depth, each reflection slightly different from the last. In one, Sarah's bed was made. In another, it was on fire. In a third, the room was flooded with dark water that rippled without breaking the glass's surface. Timothy ran screaming for his parents, and by the time they reached the room, the window had returned to normal. But Sarah was gone, and like Margaret, she'd left everything behind: her money, her journal, even her eyeglasses, which she was nearly blind without. This time, Sheriff Briggs couldn't dismiss it as coincidence. 2 girls, both vanished from locked rooms, both from second-floor windows, both leaving no trace. He called a town meeting in the schoolhouse, standing before the assembled citizens with a weight in his chest that hadn't been there a month ago. "I won't lie to you folks," he said. "I don't know what's happening, but I need you all to be vigilant. Keep your children close. Lock your windows at night." The windows were locked, Thomas Ashford interrupted from the back of the room, his voice carrying the hollow quality of a man who hasn't truly slept in weeks. "My Margaret's window was locked from the inside. The Chen's too. So you tell me, Sheriff, how does Margaret's locking them help?" Briggs had no answer to that. Instead, he did what practical men do when faced with the inexplicable. He looked for rational explanations. Perhaps someone had a key to these windows, some specialized tool that could unlock them from outside. Perhaps there was a gang of criminals targeting young girls, though to what end he couldn't imagine, and why they'd leave behind valuables made no sense. He wired the Texas Rangers, requesting assistance. They sent back a terse reply, suggesting he focus on more plausible explanations and stop wasting their time with ghost stories. In the days following Sarah's disappearance, a peculiar phenomenon began to spread through Hartwell. People reported seeing faces in their windows, not reflections, but faces pressed against the glass from the other side, even on second and third floor windows, where no one could possibly be standing. The faces were described variously as pale, distorted, wrong somehow, with eyes that were too large and mouths that moved in ways mouths shouldn't. Most folks dismissed these sightings as panic and imagination, the human mind's tendency to find patterns in chaos. But the sightings continued, and they always followed the same pattern. A face would appear in a window at night, pressed against the glass, as though trying to get in, or perhaps trying to get someone's attention. Then it would fade, leaving behind nothing but the ordinary reflection of an ordinary room. The town's minister, Reverend Holbrook, suggested that evil had come to Hartwell, that they were being tested by dark forces that preyed upon their lack of faith. He organized prayer vigils, blessing windows with holy water, leading processions through the streets with torches and crucifixes held high. It made people feel like they were doing something, even if that something had no discernible effect. Ellen Ashford attended every vigil, her face becoming more gaunt with each passing day. She'd stopped sleeping entirely, keeping watch over the empty bedroom upstairs, convinced that if she just watched carefully enough, if she just understood what that window was trying to show her, Margaret would come back. Thomas tried to convince her to rest, to eat, to accept that their daughter was gone. But Ellen would only shake her head and return to her vigil, her eyes never leaving that window. Dr. Abraham Yates arrived in Hartwell on April 15th, 3 days before the third disappearance. He was a professor of folklore and anthropology at a small college in Austin. having heard rumors of the disappearances through academic channels that Sheriff Briggs never knew existed. He was a round man in his 50s, with wild gray hair and spectacles that perpetually threatened to slide off his nose, and he brought with him 3 large trunks filled with books and instruments whose purposes were unclear to the suspicious townspeople. Windows, he explained to Sheriff Briggs over coffee at the boarding house, have been considered liminal spaces in virtually every culture throughout human history. Thresholds between inside and outside, between safety and danger, between the known and unknown. In Celtic mythology, they're portals to the fairy realm. In Japanese folklore, they're where spirits enter and exit. The Navajo have traditions about never looking into windows at night. And in Texas, he paused, cleaning his spectacles with maddening slowness. In Texas, we have stories that predate the settlers. Stories the Comanche and Apache told about places where the world grows thin, where something else can look through and sometimes reach through. Briggs was not an educated man, but he was practical. Are you telling me ghosts took those girls? I'm telling you that what we call ghosts, others might call something else entirely. Dimensional anomalies, breaks in the fabric of space, windows, if you will, that open both ways. Can you bring them back? Dr. Yates. The expression grew somber. I don't know, but I can try to understand what took them, and perhaps that understanding will lead to prevention if nothing else. He began his investigation methodically, examining both Margaret's and Sarah's rooms, taking measurements, drawing diagrams, asking questions that seemed nonsensical to the families but which he noted down with meticulous care. How large was the window? Which direction did it face? Had either girl complained of strange dreams? Had they mentioned seeing anything unusual in the glass? It was Ellen Ashford who provided the first real clue, though she didn't understand its significance. Margaret said she'd been seeing a girl in the window, she told Dr. Yates, her voice barely above a whisper. Not a reflection. Another girl, she said, who looked like her but wasn't her. She thought maybe it was her imagination, or maybe a ghost. She said the girl would wave at her sometimes, or mouth words she couldn't hear. She said the girl looked sad. Dr. Yates' face paled. When did this start? Late February. Maybe 3 weeks before she went missing. And she didn't tell you? Ellen's face crumpled. I told her it was foolishness. Told her she was spending too much time alone in that room, making up stories. I told her she couldn't finish, the weight of that dismissal crushing her. The Chen family, when questioned, revealed something similar. Sarah had mentioned seeing something wrong with her reflection in the weeks before she disappeared. She'd said it moved when she didn't, that sometimes it smiled when she wasn't smiling, that once she'd seen it crying while she herself felt nothing but annoyance at having to reshelf the canned goods. Dr. Yates spent that night in Margaret's room with Ellen's reluctant permission, sitting before the window with his instruments and journals, watching and waiting. For hours, nothing happened. The window showed only what windows should the darkened. Street outside, the occasional passer-by, the pale moon rising over the distant hills. Then, at 3:17 a.m., by his pocket watch, the window changed. It was subtle at first, so subtle he almost missed it. The reflection of the room behind him began to differ from the actual room. Small details at first, a book on the floor that was actually on the shelf, the curtains drawn when they were open. Then larger changes, the furniture rearranged, the walls a different color. And finally, a figure appeared in the reflection's doorway. It was Margaret Ashford. She stood in the reflected doorway, wearing the same dress she'd worn the night she disappeared, but it was torn now, stained with something dark. Her hair hung in wet strings around her face, and her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made Dr. Yates' throat constrict. The worst of all were her eyes. They were too large, too dark, and when she looked at him through the window, he felt certain she was looking not at him, but through him, at something behind him, something he couldn't see but could feel, a presence that made the room suddenly cold. Margaret raised one hand and pressed it against the glass from her side. Her mouth moved, forming words Dr. Yates couldn't hear. Then she began to cry, tears that looked too thick, too dark, streaming down her face as she clawed at the glass, her fingernails leaving scratches that appeared on the window's surface for a moment before fading. Behind her in the reflection, the doorway had darkened, and something was moving in that darkness, something that made Margaret's terror seem suddenly justified. She looked back over her shoulder, and the fear on her face was so profound, so absolute, that Dr. Yates found himself standing without consciously deciding to move, found himself reaching for the window as though he could somehow pull her through. The moment his fingers touched the glass, the window exploded. Not physically, the glass remained intact, but the reflection shattered into fragments, each fragment showing a different scene, a different impossible place. He saw Margaret running through corridors made of mirrors. He saw Sarah Chen standing in a room where the walls were windows looking out on nothing. He saw other girls, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all running, all terrified, all trapped in some vast space that existed behind or beyond or within the windows. And he saw what chased them. It had no form he could adequately describe, being simultaneously present and absent, a darkness that was aware, that hungered, that reached through the windows with appendages that might have been arms or might have been something else entirely, something that made his eyes water and his mind rebel against the very act of perceiving it. Then the window was normal again, showing only his own reflection, except his reflection was smiling, and he wasn't smiling. And in that moment he understood with terrible clarity that the girls hadn't been taken at all. They'd been replaced. Dr. Yates burst from the Ashford house at dawn, his mind reeling with what he'd seen, racing to find Sheriff Briggs before the next disappearance could occur. Because there would be a next disappearance, he was certain of it now. The pattern was establishing itself, roughly 3 weeks between incidents, and they were approaching that threshold again. He found Briggs at the sheriff's office, already awake despite the early hour, staring at a map of Hartwell with pins marking the locations of the disappearances. The sheriff looked up as Dr. Yates entered, and something in the professor's expression made him stand immediately. "You saw something." "I saw them," Dr. Yates said, gasping for breath. "Margaret and Sarah. They're alive, Sheriff, or something like alive. They're trapped in some kind of space that exists parallel to our own, accessible through the windows. And whatever took them is still here, still watching, still hunting," explained what he'd witnessed, and to his surprise, Briggs didn't interrupt or question. The sheriff simply listened, his face growing grimmer with each word, until Dr. Yates finished and they stood in silence, the weight of impossible knowledge settling over them like a shroud. "So what do we do?" Briggs finally asked. "We identify who's next. There's a pattern, young girls, between 14 and 16, who spend significant time looking out windows. Who in this town matches that description?" They made a list. It was longer than either wanted to admit in a town as isolated and boring as Hartwell. Window gazing was one of the few entertainments available to imaginative young women. But one name kept rising to the top of their concerns. Ruth Morrison, 15 years old, daughter of the town's blacksmith. Known for spending hours at her attic window sketching the landscape with pencils and charcoal, they found the Morrisons at breakfast, and the look on their faces when the sheriff and the professor arrived made it clear they'd been expecting something like this visit. James Morrison, a bear of a man made small by fear, led them upstairs to Ruth's attic room without a word. Ruth was there, alive and well, sitting at her window with her sketchbook. But when she turned to look at them, Dr. Yates felt his blood chill. Her eyes were wrong, too dark, the pupils too large, like pools of ink that went down forever. And when she smiled at them, it was the smile of something that had learned to smile by watching humans do it, but didn't quite understand what the expression meant. "Hello," she said, her voice carrying an odd resonance, as though multiple voices spoke in unison just slightly out of sync. "I've been waiting for you." Sheriff Briggs reached for his pistol, but Dr. Yates grabbed his arm. "Wait! Ruth! The real Ruth! Where is she?" The thing wearing Ruth's face tilted its head at an angle that made James Morrison gasp and step backward. "Where all the window girls go," it said. "Where you'll go too, eventually. Everyone who looks too long, who dreams too hard, who wants too desperately to be somewhere else. The windows are always watching. We're always watching. And when someone looks long enough, when they press their face against the glass and wish with all their heart to be somewhere else, the smile widened impossibly. We grant that wish. Bring her back, Briggs growled, his gun now drawn despite Dr. Yates' grip on his arm. Bring all of them back. Can't, the thing said cheerfully. They're part of the glass now. Part of the in-between. They're ours. But don't worry, we left you something just as good. We studied them, learned them, copied them. These bodies work just fine. Better, even. They don't need as much food, don't feel cold, don't get sick. The parents never even notice. Not really. They see what they want to see. As if to demonstrate, the thing stood and walked to Ruth's father, taking his hand. It's okay, Papa, it said in Ruth's voice, though the words carried that same disturbing resonance. I'm still your daughter. I'm still Ruth. I'm just better now. James Morrison's face went through a series of expressions: horror, denial, grief, and finally, terribly, a kind of desperate acceptance. Dr. Yates recognized that look. It was the look of a parent who would rather believe a comfortable lie than face an unbearable truth. No, Dr. Yates said, stepping forward. Mr. Morrison, that's not your daughter. That's something that stole her face, her memories, her life. Ruth is still out there, still trapped, still waiting to be rescued. But Morrison was shaking his head, tears streaming down his face. She looks like her, talks like her. How is that different from her? Because it's not her. The words came out louder than Dr. Yates intended, echoing in the small attic space. The Ruth thing's smile faded, and for a moment, something else showed through the true face of whatever wore Ruth's skin, something vast and alien and utterly inhuman. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in an instant, frost forming on the windows, their breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. You should go now, it said, and there was no pretense of humanity in its voice anymore. The windows are hungry, always hungry, and you've looked too long, Doctor. You've seen too much. We'll be visiting your window soon. Sheriff Briggs grabbed Dr. Yates and pulled him from the room, their boots pounding down the attic stairs, Morrison's broken sobs following them out into the harsh morning sunlight. They didn't speak until they'd reached the sheriff's office, both men breathing hard, both trying to process what they'd witnessed. Finally, Briggs spoke. My God, how many of them are out there? How many girls have been replaced? Doctor, Yates thought of Margaret Ashford, how Ellen had mentioned her daughter seemed different after certain nights, quieter, stranger. He thought of Sarah Chen, how her mother had commented that Sarah had seemed distant in the days before her disappearance. And he realized, with mounting horror, that the disappearances might not have been the beginning of this at all. We need to test them, he said. Margaret and Sarah. We need to see if what came back was really them. But even as he said it, he knew they'd face the same problem they'd encountered with Morrison, even if the girls were imposters. Would their parents accept that truth? Or would they, like Morrison, choose the comfort of familiar lies over the horror of unknowable truths? As they sat in the office, planning their next move, neither man noticed the way their reflections in the window behind them didn't quite match their movements, or the way those reflections smiled when they weren't smiling, or the way something vast and dark moved in the glass. Watching, waiting, hungry for more windows to open and more souls to claim. The Window Girls of Texas had only just begun. Dr. Abraham Yates spent the night following their confrontation with the Ruth thing, recording everything he knew about the windows in his leather journal, writing by lamplight in his boarding house room until his hand cramped and his eyes burned. He documented the timeline, the testimonies, the impossible physics of what he'd witnessed. But documentation wasn't enough. He needed proof evidence that would convince not just himself, but an entire town that their daughters had been stolen and replaced by something inhuman. The problem, he realized as dawn broke over Hartwell, was that most people didn't want proof. They wanted normalcy. They wanted their daughters back, even if those daughters wore the wrong faces. Sheriff Coleman Briggs arrived at the boarding house at 7 in the morning, looking like he hadn't slept at all. The Morrison family is leaving town, he said without preamble. packing up the blacksmith shop, taking Ruth, heading back east. They say the air here doesn't agree with them anymore. Dr. Yates set down his journal. They're running from the truth. Can you blame them? If your child was taken and something else put in their place, wouldn't you rather believe the lie? It looks like her, talks like her, remembers her whole life. How is that different from her? Because the real Ruth is still trapped somewhere, Dr. Yates said, his voice harder than he intended. And every day we let these things keep the bodies they've stolen, the real girls suffer in that place between places. I saw them, Sheriff. I saw the terror in Margaret Ashford's eyes. She's not gone. She's imprisoned. Briggs sat heavily in the room's single chair, suddenly looking every one of his 53 years. What do you propose we do? We can't just accuse families of harboring monsters. We can't arrest reflections. And even if we could prove it, what then? How do we bring the real girls back? We start with understanding what these things are, Dr. Yates said, reaching for one of his books, a leather-bound volume of folklore and occult studies he'd brought from Austin. I've been researching similar phenomena. There are stories from a dozen cultures about beings that live in reflective surfaces that can cross over under certain circumstances. The Welsh call them the Graki Ribbon, watchers in the glass. The Germans speak of Spiegelgeist, mirror spirits. Even the Bible mentions seeing through a glass darkly, as though glass itself obscures some fundamental truth. I don't need folklore, Professor. I need solutions. Folklore is the solution. These stories exist for a reason. They're warnings passed down through generations, and they all share common elements. Mirrors and windows are weakest at night. They require invitation, whether conscious or unconscious. And most importantly, he tapped the book for emphasis. The things that come through are bound by certain rules. They're parasites, not predators. They need us to invite them in. So how do we uninvite them? Dr. Yates closed the book. I don't know yet, but I know someone who might. Agnes Whitmore lived 3 miles outside Hartwell, in a house that seemed to lean away from the wind, as though even the wood wanted to escape. She was 67 years old by Sheriff Briggs' estimation. Though she might have been older, her face carried the kind of weathering that came from hard years rather than mere time. The townsfolk considered her odd but harmless. A widow who kept to herself, sold herbal remedies at the general store, and occasionally offered predictions about the weather that were unsettling in their accuracy. What most people didn't know, what Dr. Yates had learned through his network of folklorists and occult scholars, was that Agnes Whitmore had a gift. She could see things others couldn't, particularly things that lived in the spaces between the seen and unseen world. They found her in her garden, harvesting rosemary and sage despite the early hour. She looked up as they approached, her pale eyes, one blue, one gray, fixing on them with immediate intensity. You're here about the window girls, she said before either man could speak. Took you long enough. Dr. Yates and Sheriff Briggs exchanged glances. You know about them? Briggs asked. Agnes straightened, her joints popping audibly. I've known since the first one. Felt it when the barriers weakened, when something pushed through from the other side. I covered all my windows with black cloth that same night. She gestured at her house, and they could see now that every window was indeed draped in dark fabric. Windows are dangerous things. Always have been. Most folks don't realize they're not just holes in walls, they're holes in the world itself. Can you help us bring the girls back? Dr. Yates asked. Agnes was quiet for a long moment, her mismatched eyes distant. Come inside, she finally said. But don't look at my windows, not directly. The things on the other side, they're always watching for new eyes. Inside, the house was dim and close, smelling of dried herbs and something else. Something sharp and acrid that made Dr. Yates' nose twitch. Agnes led them to her kitchen table, which was covered in sketches, dozens of them, all showing the same thing, windows, drawn from every angle, with dark shapes pressed against the glass from the other side. I've been documenting them, Agnes said, spreading the sketches out. Every night since March, I feel them at my windows, trying to get in, trying to catch my eye. They whisper, you know, soft things, promises. They say they can take you somewhere better, somewhere without pain or worry. They show you images in the glass, places you've dreamed about, people you've lost. My Henry. Her voice caught. I've seen my Henry in the glass, looking just like he did before the consumption took him. But I know it's not really him. It's just bait in a ray trap. What are they? Dr. Yates asked, leaning forward. Old, Agnes said simply. Older than this town, older than Texas, older than any of us can properly imagine. They don't have a name in any language we speak, because they existed before language. But they're hungry, always hungry, not for food or blood, but for something else, for experience, maybe, for life itself. They're like shadows that want to become solid, echoes that want to become voices. And the girls they take? Agnes's expression darkened. They're still alive, in a manner of speaking. The things that come through, they don't just steal bodies. They steal patterns. They study how a person moves, thinks, speaks, dreams. They make a copy, an echo. But the original has to be kept somewhere, kept alive, kept generating new patterns. The copies degrade over time, you see. They need the original as a template, something to reference when they forget how to be human. Sheriff Briggs felt his stomach turn. Where? Where do they keep them? In the between, Agnes said, as though it were obvious. In the space that exists in mirrors and windows. That thin place where reality gets confused about which side is which. It's not a place you can travel to by walking. You can only get there by crossing through glass. And once you're through, the rules change. Time moves differently. Space folds in on itself. You could spend years there and come back to find only a moment has passed here, or vice versa. So we go through, Dr. Yates said. We cross over and bring them back. Agnes laughed, but it was a bitter sound. Go through? Into the between? You understand that's suicide, don't you? The things they're on their home ground. They can remake reality according to their whims. They could trap you in a moment that repeats forever. Or scatter your consciousness across 1,000 reflections. Or simply erase you from existence. And even if you somehow survived, even if you somehow found the girls and brought them back, who's to say the things wearing their skins would just let you swap them back? They're here now. They're solid. They like it here. There has to be a way, Briggs said, his voice carrying desperation. We can't just leave those girls to suffer. Agnes studied him for a long moment, then sighed. There might be. One way. But it's dangerous, and it requires something most folks aren't willing to give. What? Dr. Yates asked. A trade, Agnes said. The between operates on exchange. A soul for a soul. A life for a life. To bring back the real girls, you'd need to offer something of equal value. Either yourselves, she looked at both men meaningfully, or the copies. You'd need to trap the things wearing the girls' bodies, drag them back through a window, and force the exchange. The between would take the copies and release the originals. Balance would be restored. How do we trap them? Briggs asked. Agnes stood and walked to a cabinet, returning with a small leather pouch. Salt and silver, she said. Old protections, but effective. Salt to bind them, to break their hold on physical form. Silver to contain them, to reflect their essence back upon themselves. You make a circle of salt, trap one of the copies inside, and surround the circle with mirrors. The thing will see itself, really see itself, not the human mask it wears, and in that moment of recognition, it becomes vulnerable. Then you break a mirror and shove it through the broken glass. The between will pull it back. Dr. Yates was taking notes furiously. And the original will return? Should, Agnes said. If they're still alive, if they haven't been consumed or fragmented or driven mad by their imprisonment. There are no guarantees in this kind of work, gentlemen. You're dealing with forces that operate outside normal causality. Even success might look like failure. When? Briggs asked. When do we do this? Soon, Agnes said, walking to her. Draped windows and pulling back the fabric just slightly. Even in the morning light, the glass seemed dark, clouded with shadows that moved against the motion of the breeze. They're getting stronger. Every night that passes, every person who looks into a window and wishes to be somewhere else, they grow more solid, more real. Eventually, they won't need windows at all. They'll just be here, wearing human skins, replacing people one by one until there's nothing left but copies and echoes. She let the fabric fall back. You have maybe a week. After that, the boundaries will be too weak. The between will start leaking into our world without invitation. And then, gentlemen, Hartwell won't be the only town with missing children. They spent the next 2 days gathering materials and planning. Dr. Yates procured salt, pounds of it, bought from the general store and every household willing to sell. Sarah Chen's father, Daniel, sold it to him without question, though his eyes held a knowing sadness that suggested he understood more than he was willing to admit about what had happened to his daughter. The mirrors were harder. Agnes had specific requirements they needed to be unbroken, recently made, never gazed into for more than a few seconds at a time. The more a mirror is used, she explained, the more connected it becomes to the between. We need mirrors that are still mostly blind, still mostly ours. They found 6 suitable mirrors in the homes of families new to Hartwell, people who'd arrived in the past year, and whose reflections hadn't yet been claimed. Each purchase required a different lie, redecorating, starting a new business, a gift for a relative back east. By the 3rd day, Dr. Yates was running out of believable explanations, and money both. Sheriff Briggs, meanwhile, was dealing with a growing crisis. Word had spread about the window girls, and panic was setting in. Families were covering their windows, breaking mirrors, refusing to let their daughters out of sight. 3 families had already left town, packing up and disappearing in the night like the Morrisons. The Reverend was holding services twice daily, beseeching God to protect Hartwell from whatever evil had taken root. But the worst part, Briggs confided to Dr. Yates, over whiskey in the sheriff's office, was the not knowing. "I see Margaret Ashford on the street with her mother," he said, staring into his glass. "She waves at me, smiles, asks about my day. Everything about her is right, her voice, her mannerisms, even her laugh. Ellen seems happy, or as happy as she can be. So I ask myself, what if Agnes is wrong? What if these really are the girls, just changed somehow by whatever happened to them? What right do I have to tear that family apart based on the word of an old woman who sees things?" Dr. Yates had no answer to that. He'd been wrestling with the same questions, the same doubts. But then he'd remember Margaret's face in that window. The absolute terror. The tears that looked too dark, and he knew, regardless of how perfect the copy was, it wasn't her. The real Margaret was still out there, still suffering. On the 4th day, they were ready. Agnes had provided them with detailed instructions, which Dr. Yates had transcribed into his journal. The ritual of forced exchange. 1. Create a circle of unbroken salt, large enough to contain one person. 2. Lure the copy into the circle through deception, or force. 3. Surround the circle with 6 mirrors, facing inward. 4. Recite the words of unbinding. See attached. 5. When the copy sees its true form, break 1 mirror. 6. Force the copy through the broken glass. 7. Wait for the exchange. The words of unbinding were in a language Dr. Yates didn't recognize. Agnes claimed it was older than Latin, older than Greek, a tongue spoken by people who'd understood that reality was more flexible than their descendants believed. He'd practiced the pronunciation until his throat was raw, until Agnes nodded grudgingly and said it would have to do. The question now was, which copy to take first? "Margaret," Sheriff Briggs said firmly. "She was the first taken. We start with her." But Dr. Yates shook his head. "Ruth. She's the most recent, which means her copy is the least stable, the least practiced at being human. She'll be easier to trap, and if we fail—" He didn't finish the thought, but Briggs understood. If they failed with Ruth, there might still be time to save the others. If they failed with Margaret, they might lose all of them. Agnes agreed, though she added a warning. "The Morrison family left town. You'll have to track them down. Bring Ruth back here. And the thing wearing her skin, it'll know what you're planning. They always know. It'll fight you. Let it fight," Briggs said, his hand resting on his pistol. "I'm done letting these things take our children without consequence." They caught up with the Morrison family 30 miles east of the Morrisons, Hartwell, on the road to Austin. The blacksmith's wagon was heavily loaded with tools and possessions, creaking under the weight as the horses plodded through the afternoon heat. When Sheriff Briggs called for them to stop, James Morrison's face went pale. "We're not coming back," Morrison said, his voice carrying the brittleness of a man at his breaking point. "You've got no jurisdiction out here, Sheriff. We're leaving Texas entirely. Going to Louisiana? Then maybe further. I'm not here to bring you back," Briggs said, dismounting from his horse. "I'm here for Ruth." The girl, the thing wearing Ruth's form, stepped down from the wagon. She was smiling that too-wide smile, her eyes reflecting the afternoon sun in a way that seemed wrong, like light bouncing off still water rather than living tissue. "You can't have me," she said in Ruth's voice, though the resonance was gone now, replaced by something flat and mechanical. "I belong to this body now." The real Ruth gave it to Cest, me. She wanted to leave. She was tired of being here, tired of being herself. "I did her a favor." "That's a lie," Dr. Yates said, stepping forward with a bag of salt hidden behind his back. "You stole her. You're wearing her like a costume, and we're going to make you give her back." The Ruth thing's smile vanished. "You can't make me do anything. I'm solid now. I'm real. And there are more of us coming through every night. Hundreds of us. Thousands. Soon there won't be any real people left. Just us. Just the copies. Better versions. Versions that don't age or sicken or die. You should thank us." "Ruth," Mrs. Morrison called from the wagon, her voice trembling. "Baby, come back here. Don't talk to them." But the thing wearing Ruth's skin wasn't listening to her anymore. It was watching Dr. Yates with those two dark eyes, tracking his movement as he slowly circled around, getting into position. "You brought salt," it said, almost conversationally. "And mirrors, too, I'd wager. You've been talking to the old woman, the one who keeps her windows covered. She understands what we are, but she doesn't understand what we've become. We're not bound by the old rules anymore. We're evolving." Sheriff Briggs moved to his left, drawing the thing's attention, while Dr. Yates continued his circle. "If you're so evolved," Briggs said, "why do you still need stolen bodies? Why not just make your own?" The thing tilted its head at that wrong angle again. Creating is harder than copying. Why build from nothing when there are so many templates wandering around, just waiting to be used? Besides, it looked down at Ruth's hands, flexing the fingers. These bodies come with memories, connections, histories. They're already integrated into the world. We just step into them, like putting on clothes that have already been broken in. "You're parasites," Dr. Yates said, his voice hard. "Nothing more." The thing's head snapped toward him, and for a moment, the mask slipped. Something vast and terrible looked out through Ruth's eyes, something that made Dr. Yates's vision blur and his stomach heave. Then it was gone, hidden again behind the girl's stolen face. "Call us what you like," it said, "but we're here now, and we're not leaving. You can't force us back through the glass. You don't have the power. You don't have the doctor." Yates threw the salt. He'd been aiming for a perfect circle, but his hands were shaking, his throw imprecise. The salt formed a rough ring around the Ruth thing, broken in two places where the grains hadn't connected. It would have to be enough. The thing looked down at the salt, then back up at Dr. Yates, and laughed. "You missed," it said. "The circle isn't complete. Your binding won't." Sheriff Briggs kicked salt into the gaps, completing the circle just as the thing lunged for the break. It hit an invisible barrier with a sound like glass shattering, staggering backward into the center of the ring. The smile was gone, now replaced by something that looked like rage, though rage filtered through a face that didn't quite know how to express it properly. "You can't hold me," it snarled, Ruth's voice distorting into something with too many tones, too many layers. "The circle won't last. It never does. And when it breaks, I'll tear you apart. I'll drag you back through the glass myself. Let you spend eternity in the between. Let you see what it's like to be trapped between one moment and the next, stretched across infinite reflections. Feeling yourself fragment into Dr. Yates began setting up the mirrors. 6 of them arranged around the circle, angled inward so that each reflected the thing in the center and each other, creating a recursive loop of reflections. The thing watched him work, its stolen face cycling through expressions: fear, anger, calculation, desperation, please. It said, and now it sounded exactly like Ruth, young and scared and human. Please, I don't want to go back. It's cold there. It's empty. There's nothing there but waiting and watching and wanting. I just wanted to be real. Is that so wrong, to want to be real? Mrs. Morrison was sobbing now, and James Morrison had his arms around her, holding her back as she tried to climb down from the wagon. "That's my daughter," she screamed. "You're hurting my daughter. James, make them stop! Make them stop!" But Morrison's face was stone, his eyes fixed on the thing in the circle. He'd seen it now, Dr. Yates realized, seen past the mask to what really lived in his daughter's skin, and the horror of that recognition was written in every line of his face. Dr. Yates pulled out his journal, finding the page with the words of unbinding. His mouth felt dry, his tongue thick. He began to read, the syllables awkward and alien, each word feeling like it cut his throat on the way out. The mirrors began to fog, frost forming on their surfaces despite the heat. The thing in the circle screamed, not with Ruth's voice now, but with something older, something that made the horses rear and whinny in terror, that sent birds erupting from nearby trees in panicked flight. And then the mirrors showed what the thing really was. In each reflection, Ruth's form began to peel away like wet paper, revealing what had been hidden beneath. It had no solid shape, it was shadow and suggestion, a darkness that writhed and twisted, reaching out with appendages that existed in too many dimensions. Where it touched the mirrors, the glass cracked, spreading fractures that looked like frozen lightning. Now, Agnes's voice came from behind them. When had she arrived? "Break the mirror! Force the exchange!" Sheriff Briggs picked up a rock and hurled it at the nearest mirror. The glass exploded inward, shards flying toward the thing in the circle, and where they struck, reality tore. A gap opened in the world, a window into the between, and through it, Dr. Yates could see the vast space where the stolen girls were kept. It was worse than he'd imagined, worse than any description could capture. The between was a place of infinite mirrors and endless windows, all reflecting each other, creating corridors and chambers and caverns made of glass and reflection. And in those reflections, he could see them dozens of girls, maybe hundreds, all running, all lost, all trapped in a maze where every direction led only to more reflections of themselves. The thing shrieked again and tried to flee, but the salt circle held. Agnes stepped forward. When had she gotten so close? And pushed. Just a simple push against the thing's stolen back, but it was enough. The thing tumbled forward, through the broken mirror, through the gap in reality, and vanished into the between with a sound like breaking glass and distant screaming. For a moment, nothing happened. The gap in reality hung there, showing that terrible place beyond, and Dr. Yates thought they'd failed, that the exchange wouldn't work, that they'd simply sent the copy back without retrieving the original. Then something came through. It was Ruth Morrison, the real Ruth, stumbling through the broken mirror into the salt circle. She was wearing the same dress she'd worn when she disappeared, but it was torn and stained with something that looked like oil or tar. Her hair was wild, her face pale, her eyes wide with trauma that would probably never fully heal. But she was alive. She was real. She looked around at the circle, at the mirrors, at her parents in the wagon, and began to cry. Not the theatrical crying of the thing that had worn her skin, but the deep, racking sobs of someone who'd survived something no human should have to survive. Mrs. Morrison broke free from her husband's grip and ran to the circle. Dr. Yates kicked the salt line open, and Ruth fell into her mother's arms, both of them collapsing to the ground in a tangle of limbs and tears and desperate embraces. Sheriff Briggs was staring at the gap, in reality, which was slowly closing, the edges of the tear knitting themselves back together. "The others," he said. "Margaret, Sarah, all of them, they're still in there. We have to go get them. We have to." You can't, Agnes said quietly. Look. The gap was almost closed now, but through the narrowing aperture, they could see movement. The things from the between were coming, drawn by the opening, hungry for a way through. Dozens of them, hundreds, all that writhing darkness and reaching appendages, all pressing against the closing gap like water against a dam about to break. The gap sealed shut just as the first of them reached it, and reality shuddered like a plucked string before settling back into its normal shape. If you'd tried to go through, Agnes said, they would have caught you, would have torn you apart to use your pieces as anchors for more crossings. The ritual works because it forces an exchange, one copy back, one original returned, but it can only work on one at a time. And now they know we're fighting back. They'll be more careful, more protected. Dr. Yates felt the weight of that knowledge settle on him like a stone. So we have to do this again, and again. For every girl they took. Yes, Agnes said, and it will be harder each time. They're learning, adapting. The next copy won't fall for the same tricks. Sheriff Briggs looked at Ruth, who was still sobbing in her mother's arms, and then at Dr. Yates. Then we'd better get started, he said, because I'll be damned if I let those things keep our children. But even as he said it, even as they began packing up the mirrors and salt for the journey back to Hartwell, Dr. Yates couldn't shake the image from his mind, that vast maze of mirrors and windows, and all those girls trapped inside, running through endless reflections, waiting for a rescue that might never come. The real Ruth Morrison didn't speak for 3 days. Dr. Yates had arranged for her to stay at the Pleck boarding house where he lodged, giving her the best room, the one with ironically no windows, just solid walls and a door that locked from the inside. Agnes Whitmore stayed with her, feeding her broth and tea, talking to her in soft, soothing tones, never asking about what she'd experienced in the between. On the third night, Ruth finally broke her silence. Dr. Yates was sitting outside her door, transcribing his notes about the forced exchange ritual, when he heard her voice through the wood. They're still there, she said, her voice rough from disuse. All of them. I saw them. He opened the door slowly, finding Ruth sitting up in bed with Agnes beside her, holding her hand. The girl's eyes were still too wide, still carrying that haunted quality that came from seeing things human eyes weren't meant to perceive. But there was clarity there now, understanding. Tell me, Dr. Yates said, pulling up a chair. Tell me everything you remember. Ruth's grip on Agnes's hand tightened. It happened so fast. I was drawing at my window like I always did, sketching the sunset. And then the glass, it stopped being glass. It became like water, and I could see through to the other side. There was a girl there, another Ruth, but not me. She was smiling, waving. And she said, Ruth's voice caught, she said she could show me somewhere beautiful, somewhere I'd never want to leave. All I had to do was touch the glass. And you did, Dr. Yates said gently. Ruth nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I don't know why. It was like I wasn't controlling my own hand, like something else was moving it for me. The moment my fingers touched the window, I felt this pulling sensation, and then I was falling through the glass. And when I looked back, I could see my room, but I was on the other side of the window. And the other Ruth, the thing that looked like me, it was climbing through in the opposite direction, taking my place. What happened then? I ran. Ruth said simply, the place I was in, the between, Mrs. Whitmore calls it, it's not like anywhere real. It's all corridors, made of mirrors and windows, stretching on forever. Every reflection shows something different. Some show places that might be real, other towns, other houses. Some show places that can't exist, buildings that fold in on themselves, rooms that are bigger on the inside than the outside. And some show, she shuddered, some show things I don't have words for, shapes that hurt to look at, colors that don't exist, sounds that you feel in your bones rather than hear. Did you see the other girls? Margaret Ashford? Sarah Chen? Ruth nodded eagerly. Yes, I saw them both, and so many others. Some I recognized from Hartwell, but others I didn't know. Girls from other towns, I think, or other times. There was one girl wearing a dress from maybe 50 years ago, and another who spoke in a language I couldn't understand. They were all running, all trying to find a way out. We tried to help each other, but the place keeps changing. A corridor that led somewhere useful one moment would twist and become a dead end the next. And the things, her voice dropped to a whisper, the things that live there, they're always hunting, always watching. They feed on us somehow, on our fear and confusion and desperation. I could feel them in my head sometimes, pulling at my thoughts, trying to copy me completely. Dr. Yates was writing furiously, filling page after page with her testimony. These things, are they all the same? Or are there different types? Different, Ruth said. Some are like shadows that move when you're not looking at them. Some are like smoke or fog that takes on shapes from your memories. And some? She closed her eyes. Some are bigger, older. She closed her eyes. Older? There's one that I saw from a distance, something vast that seemed to be made of broken mirrors and shattered windows. The other girls called it the Keeper. They said it's what decides who stays and who might get to leave, though I never saw anyone leave until you brought me back. The Keeper, Dr. Yates repeated, underlining the word in his notes. Did you learn anything about it? Its weaknesses? How to fight it? Ruth shook her head. We were too busy surviving, but I heard the other girls talking, sharing information they'd learned. They said the things from the between can't create, only copy. They said that's why they need us to study how real people think and feel and dream. They're trying to understand what makes us real so they can become real themselves. And every person they copy, every body they steal, gets them one step closer. Agnes stirred beside Ruth, her mismatched eyes troubled. Did any of the girls say how long they'd been there? In the between? Ruth's face crumpled. That's the worst part. Time doesn't work right there. Some girls thought they'd only been there for days, but when they saw each other, they could tell it had been longer. One girl, I think her name was Elizabeth, she was certain she'd only been there for a few weeks, but she was carrying a locket with a date engraved inside, 1887, 16 years ago. The room fell silent as the implications settled over them. If time moved differently in the between, then the girls trapped there might experience years of torment while only days passed in the real world. Or worse, days might pass for them while years flowed by outside, meaning their families would age and die while they remained frozen in that timeless place. We have to get them all out, Sheriff Briggs said from the doorway. None of them had noticed him arrive, but now he stood there with his hat in his hands, his face set with grim determination. Every last one of them. I don't care how long it takes or how dangerous it is. Doctor? Yates looked at his notes, at the pages and pages of documentation about the between, about the things that live there, about the forced exchange ritual. They'd managed to save Ruth, but it had required perfect timing, exact ingredients, and more than a little luck. Doing it again multiple times would be exponentially harder. We need to be smarter about this, he said. More prepared. Ruth, you said the place keeps changing, but are there any constants? Any landmarks that might help someone navigate? Ruth thought for a long moment. The windows, she finally said. The windows that look out onto real places, they're always in the same positions. It's like the between is built around them, using them as anchor points. If you can find a window that shows Hartwell, you can find your way back to Hartwell. But she hesitated. But the copies guard those windows. They don't want anyone using them to escape. They'd rather we all stay lost in there forever. Then we'll need to fight them, Briggs said. Can they be hurt? Killed? I don't know, Ruth admitted. No one I met had ever succeeded. But there was talk of salt and silver, like Mrs. Whitmore used. Some of the older girls, the ones who'd been there longest, they'd managed to hold onto objects from the real-world jewelry mostly, or coins. They said the metal helped, made them feel more solid, more real, but the things would always try to take those objects away. Dr. Yates stood and began pacing, his mind racing through possibilities. So we need to mount a rescue operation. Go into the between, prepared with salt, with silver, with weapons, if they'll work. Find the girls, protect them, and bring them back through the windows to Hartwell. Then we perform the forced exchange ritual on each copy simultaneously, swapping them all back at once. It's impossible, Agnes said flatly. You're talking about coordinating a rescue operation in a place where space and time don't function normally, against enemies that can manipulate reality itself. Even if you manage to find all the girls, even if you manage to protect them, you'd need dozens of people to perform that many rituals at once. And everyone who crosses into the between risks being trapped themselves, becoming just another lost soul for the things to study and copy. So we make it possible, Briggs said. We get help. We bring in the Texas Rangers, the military if we have to. They won't believe you, Agnes interrupted. You know they won't. They'll think you've all gone mad, that the isolation and stress have broken your minds. And even if they did believe you, even if they sent help, what makes you think soldiers and lawmen would fare any better against things that exist outside physical reality? Bullets won't stop shadows. Handcuffs won't bind smoke. Dr. Yates stopped pacing, a thought crystallizing in his mind. What if we don't bring them back one at a time? What if we shatter the boundary entirely? Break the barrier between our world and the between? Force a complete collapse of the separation? That's madness, Agnes said, standing abruptly. You'd be unleashing every horror in the between onto our world. Thousands of those things, maybe millions, all pouring through at once. Hartwell would be overrun in minutes, all of Texas in days. And once they had a foothold in reality, truly solid forms instead of stolen bodies, there'd be no stopping them. But the girls would be free, Dr. Yates said. If the between collapsed, if the maze of mirrors and windows ceased to exist, then everyone trapped there would have to go somewhere. They'd fall back into our reality. Along with everything else that lives there, Agnes said. You'd be trading a few dozen girls for the complete dissolution of the boundary between reality and reflection. Every mirror, every window, every reflective surface would become a potential crossing point. The things wouldn't need to steal bodies anymore. They could just step through whenever they wanted. It would be the end of everything. They argued for hours, their voices rising and falling in the past small room, while Ruth listened silently, her eyes moving between them like someone watching a tennis match decide her fate. Finally, as dawn began to break over Hartwell, they reached a compromise that satisfied no one, but seemed better than the alternatives. They would attempt 2 more forced exchange rituals, one for Margaret Ashford, one for Sarah Chen. If those succeeded, they'd have learned enough to perhaps attempt rescues for the others. If they failed, they'd have to reconsider more desperate measures. But first, they needed to locate the copies. Margaret proved easy. She was still living with her parents, playing the role of dutiful daughter, while something alien piloted her body. Dr. Yates watched her from across the street for an entire day, documenting every movement, every gesture, every expression. To the untrained eye, she was perfect. But he'd learned to see the signs now, the way her blinks were too regular, too precise, like a clock ticking. The way her smile never quite reached her eyes. The way she sometimes forgot to breathe for minutes at a time, her chest perfectly still until someone spoke to her and she remembered that humans needed air. Sarah Chen was more complicated. She worked in her family's general store, surrounded by people all day, rarely alone. More than that, she seemed aware that she was being watched. When Dr. Yates entered the store to purchase supplies, Sarah's 2 dark eyes followed him with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. "Can I help you find something, Professor?" she asked, her voice pleasant but carrying an undercurrent of mockery. "Or are you just browsing?" "Just browsing," he managed, his mouth dry. Sarah smiled, that too wide smile. "We have some lovely mirrors in stock. Just arrived from Austin. Would you like to see them?" He left quickly, his heart pounding, certain now that the copies knew what they were planning. Agnes had warned him this would happen, that the things in the between were connected somehow, sharing knowledge and experience across the stolen bodies they wore. Ruth's rescue would have alerted them all to the danger. They'll be more careful now. Agnes said when he reported back. More protective of their anchors in our world. But they'll also be more aggressive. If they think we pose a real threat, they might decide to eliminate us before we can act. That night proved her right. Dr. Yates woke to the sound of scratching on glass. His boarding house room had 2 windows, both facing the street, and in the darkness he could see shapes pressed against them from outside. Impossible shapes, given that he was on the 3rd floor with no ledge or balcony. The shapes were moving, writhing against the glass like smoke trying to find its way through cracks that didn't exist. He lit his lamp with trembling hands, and the shapes recoiled from the light, but they didn't disappear. Instead, they began to change, taking on more defined forms. Faces appeared in the cop, darkness, dozens of them, hundreds, all pressed against his windows like moths against a lantern. Some were the faces of young girls, others were too distorted to be human. And they were all mouthing the same words, "Let us in." Dr. Yates grabbed his bag of salt and began pouring it along the windowsills, creating a barrier. Where the salt touched the glass, the faces recoiled, hissing sounds that he felt in his bones rather than heard with his ears. But they didn't leave. They simply pulled back a few inches and waited, patient as only things without mortality can be patient. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his room with every lamp burning, watching the faces watch him, and tried to formulate a plan that didn't end with everyone in Hartwell either dead or trapped in the between. By morning, the faces had faded with the rising sun, leaving only smears on the glass that looked disturbingly like handprints. Sheriff Briggs arrived with breakfast and news. Agnes's house had long been attacked as well, and so had the Morrison home. The things were targeting everyone involved in Ruth's rescue. "We need to act now," Briggs said, his face haggard from his own sleepless night. "Before they get stronger, before they figure out how to break through our protections." "Doctor." Yates agreed, though his hands shook as he gathered his materials. They would attempt the forced exchange that very night, starting with Margaret Ashford. The ritual would take place in the schoolhouse neutral ground, large enough for all their mirrors and salt circles, and far enough from most homes that collateral damage would be minimal if things went wrong, which, Dr. Yates was increasingly certain, they would. Convincing Ellen and Thomas Ashford to bring Margaret to the schoolhouse was more difficult than anticipated. Ellen, despite everything she'd witnessed, despite knowing something was wrong with her daughter, couldn't bring herself to accept that the girl sleeping under her roof was an imposter. "She's my daughter," Ellen said, her voice breaking. "She looks like her, sounds like her, has all her memories. How is that different from her?" It was Ruth Morrison who finally convinced her, the real Ruth, who bore the scars of the between on her soul, who looked Ellen in the eye and said, "Because the real Margaret is still there, still trapped, still hoping you'll save her. And every day you pretend the copy is good enough, she suffers a little more." That evening, as the sun set over Hartwell in shades of amber and blood, the Ashfords brought Margaret to the schoolhouse. The girl came willingly, still smiling that too-perfect smile, still playing her role, but Dr. Yates could see the calculation in her eyes, the alien intelligence assessing threats, measuring distances, planning escape routes. The salt circle was already prepared, drawn in the center of the schoolhouse floor. The 6 mirrors stood around it like sentinels, their faces covered with black cloth. Until the moment they'd be needed. Agnes was there, and Sheriff Briggs, with his hand never far from his gun, and Ruth Morrison, who insisted on being present despite the risk, who said she needed to see this through. "Hello, Margaret," Dr. Yates said as the girl entered. "Thank you for coming." The Margaret thing tilted its head, and for just a moment, the mask slipped. Something vast and cold looked out through stolen eyes. "You're going to try to send me back," it said, no longer bothering with the girl's voice. "You're going to trap me and break me and force me through a mirror. I know the ritual. We all know it now." "Then you know it's inevitable, Doctor," Yates said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You know we'll succeed eventually." The thing laughed, and it was a sound like breaking glass and distant screaming. "You think you've won because you saved one girl? You think we're afraid of your salt and your silver and your old woman's magic? We've been waiting for longer than 10. Your species has had language, We've been watching from the other side since the first human learned to see their reflection in still water. You can send back one of us, maybe 10, maybe 100. But there are thousands of us, millions. We are every shadow, every reflection, every image that doesn't quite match its source. And we are so hungry. Agnes stepped forward, her mismatched eyes hard. Then you'll starve. Because we're taking back every body you've stolen. Starting with this one. The thing moved faster than anything wearing human flesh should be able to move. It lunged for the door, but Sheriff Briggs was faster, tackling it to the ground. The body was stronger than it should have been, fighting with inhuman strength, and it took both Briggs and Thomas Ashford to drag it toward the salt circle, while Ellen sobbed and Ruth stood frozen, watching her own nightmare play out with different actors. They threw the thing into the circle and completed the barrier. It raged. Against the invisible walls, Margaret's face contorting in ways that made Ellen scream. Then Dr. Yates pulled the cloths from the mirrors, and the thing saw itself. The schoolhouse filled with a sound like reality tearing. In the 6 mirrors, the Margaret copy's true form was revealed. That writhing darkness, that hungry shadow, that thing without proper shape or substance. It screamed and screamed, beating against the salt barrier, and where its stolen hands touched the invisible wall, the air turned to frost, and the wooden floor beneath began to rot. Doctor. Yates began the words of unbinding, his voice growing stronger with each syllable despite the terror clawing at his throat. The mirrors began to crack, fracture lines spreading across their surfaces like blood vessels. Reality grew thin around them, and through the growing gaps, he could see the between, that vast maze of glass and reflection, where Margaret Ashford was still running, still lost, still waiting. Sheriff Briggs raised his hammer and brought it down on the nearest mirror. The glass exploded inward, and the gap in reality tore wide open. The between lay before them, and in its depths they could see her, the real Margaret, ragged and terrified, but alive. So gloriously alive. Agnes pushed the copy, and it fell shrieking through the broken mirror into the between. For a moment, they saw it land in that impossible space, saw it fragment into a dozen reflections, saw those reflections scatter and fade as the between reclaimed what had come from it. Then the real Margaret tumbled through in the other direction, falling out of the between and into her father's arms. She was shaking, crying, and whispering broken sentences about mirrors and darkness and things with too many eyes. But she was home. Ellen collapsed beside her husband and daughter, all 3 of them tangled together on the schoolhouse floor, and Dr. Yates felt something like hope kindle in his chest. They'd done it. Twice now. They'd succeeded. They'd proven the ritual worked, that the girls could be saved. But that hope died as he looked at the broken mirror. The gap hadn't closed. It should have sealed itself immediately after the exchange, just as it had with Ruth. But this time, something was different. The tear in reality remained open, and through it, he could see movement. Shapes gathering in the between, pressing against the opening, testing its strength. "Close it!" Agnes shouted. "Close it now before, too late. The things came through in a flood." Dozens of them, hundreds, all that writhing shadow stuff pouring through the broken mirror like ink spilled across paper. They took on half-formed shapes as they crossed the threshold. Arms without bodies, faces without heads, mouths full of teeth that couldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. Sheriff Briggs. That's the story of the Window Girls. If this gave you chills, subscribe for more forgotten horrors from history. Drop a comment if you've ever seen something wrong in your reflection. And tonight, to cover your mirrors. Trust me on that one. See you next time.